Hi, and a warm welcome to this new episode of Research Insights Live. In the run-up to International Migrants Day, today we'll be focusing on seeking systemic action for refugees and migrants. My name is Lynn Zebeda, and I'll take you through the conversations today with highly interesting, inspiring speakers from ISS, the International Institute of Social Studies, and other amazing guests who are doing the work, important work around the theme of today. We'll be sharing a whole kaleidoscope of insights in 3 blocks, and there will be opportunities for you watching at home for asking questions. And for that, we'll be using Mentimeter. I think a lot of us already know how it works, but I'll explain anyway in a little bit. But when you do ask questions, I want to ask you to please keep it short and address to which speaker you want to ask the question to. So how does this work? We'll go to menti.com. Let's test it all out together right here, right now. Go to menti.com, and then you can use this code that you see. So that's 3903-1629. And then you'll join us for this episode. And I want to just test it out with a simple question, which is, do you or does your family have a history of migration? And if yes, from which countries? So for me, for example, I would definitely be a yes. I would say yes from Suriname, and then West Africa, and some Barbados, the UK, and then Germany, and that's kind of as far as I can get. But we're curious about you and your family and your history of migration. So please grab your phone, menti.com, with this code. And I'll come to your answers in a second. First, I would like to introduce you to my fellow guides of this episode. The first one is my absolutely wonderful colleague, Jamel Buhari, who will open our minds in creative ways throughout this episode. Jamel.
Yes, my name is Jamel Buhari, and I'll be coming in today with different artistic intermezzos.
Yes, great. My other guide today is a lady called Anila Noor, who is a policy advisor on diversity, integration, and gender inclusion. Having a refugee background herself, she also thinks along now as an expert at EU level, and she founded the New Women Connectors. Anila, are you with us? She's muted. Anila, could you unmute yourself?
No, I'm not in muted.
Oh, yeah, okay. She's not muted.
I'm not.
Hi, Anila. Welcome to this episode.
Thank you.
Can we see her? Oh, great.
This happens when refugees start talking.
This happens. Wow. I just want to ask you, Anila, what does New Women Connectors do? Could you explain that in one sentence to us?
Yes, sure. New Women Connector is connecting, as you can feel, is connecting the knowledge, is connecting the spaces, connecting the human to human level. So I'm proud to be a alumni of ISS, and I'm trying to influence on the policy debate, like nothing about us without us.
Nice. We're going to hear a lot more from you. I'm going to call upon your wisdom and experience throughout this episode. So thanks so much for joining us. Shall we have a look if we already have some Mentimeter responses here? Oh, yeah. Look at that. Yes. Germany, from Turkey to Belgium, UK and Germany. Yes, Indonesia, from China to the Netherlands. My father migrated to the UK from Zimbabwe. No, I see one no there. Yes, I'm from Iran, Philippines, New Caledonia, Fiji. Wow. It's very special to see that there's very little no's in here, of course. Very little families without a history of migration. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for participating so actively already. We're happy to have you here. Please continue doing so. All right, as I said, we're going to do this in 3 blocks with very special speakers, and we're ready to go into our first one. Indeed, humanity as the foundation of our whole entire conversation. In this first section, we will explore more about what humanity really means in the context of the conversation we're having today, and what does it mean to be a humane human in the face of humanity facing so many things, so many challenges. And I have here with me 3 wonderful guests. Here we have Hannah Benjedi. You're a pediatric resident at the AMC. We'll hear a lot more about what you do in a second. Welcome.
Thank you.
So happy you're here.
Thank you.
Then we have Zemzem Shigute Shuka on my left. You're an assistant professor of global health and development at ISS. Also, always fantastic to see you, Zemzem. Welcome. And lastly, we have Mahardika Shamsud Sajjad, PhD researcher
Correct.
at ISS. Correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for pronouncing my name correctly.
Yes, first score of the day. Great. Very welcome at the table.
It's
as
very
well.
nice to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. So before we really dive into this conversation, I want to have our first little intermezzo by the lovely Jamel.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. And before we delve into this theme, I would like us all to have a look at a clip of a short documentary titled The Island of All Together. This documentary was made by filmmakers Philip Brink and Marieke van der Velde, and it was all shot at the Greek island of Lesbos. And it shows what happens when different people, Europeans, actually tourists and refugees meet, and when they actually talk to each other instead of talk about each other. Let's have a look.
Hello, hello. أهلا وسهلا.
Hello,
كيف
welcome.
الحال؟
My name is Tilman Speck
غانم الحافظ. I am من سوريا.
from Syria.
نعم. أيوة. وصلت امبارح لهون عن طريق البحر.
Okay, with a boat.
نعم.
Okay.
يعني أنت قاعد هون؟ أنت من يعني أنت من هون؟
No.
سياحة يعني سياحة.
I'm a tourist. I'm only for 2 weeks here in Lesbos, and in 3 days we fly back to Germany.
إن شاء الله بنجتمع هني.
You come to Stuttgart. If you're in Stuttgart, you call me with your telephone and.
أنت لطيف جدا.
Oh, thank you.
أهلا وسهلا. أهلا وسهلا.
Yeah, The Island of All Together. You can find the whole film online and have a look at more of these encounters between people. I want to remind you before we start that you can ask your questions to the speaker via menti.com. Now it will show you a screen where you can fill in your question. So menti.com with the code 39031629. All right, Hannah. I want to ask you a couple of questions because I know we've known each other for a while, and I know that you have important thoughts to share about this topic of today. But first, I just want to ask you, what is it that you do? I very briefly introduced you, but what is it that you do, and how does it connect to the theme of today?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be sharing this table with so many special guests. So I'm a pediatric doctor, which means I'm not a pediatrician yet, but I'm a resident in pediatrics on my way to being a pediatrician. And I work in the Emma Children's Hospital here in Amsterdam. And I've been to Greece a couple of times as a medical volunteer, doing medical work in Camp Moria, which is now Camp Mavrovouni, the new camp. And I've been a medical coordinator for the Boat Refugee Foundation. So I have some experience with the medical care there, and currently we're setting up a research initiative to describe the health of the refugee children in a better way.
Yeah, exactly. So you've been to that island where those 2 gentlemen are sitting on the bench.
Yes.
Have you sat on that bench?
I don't know that bench
That bench
specifically.
Yeah,
But I
that's
know the
place.
beautiful island, yes.
Yeah, the beautiful island and the not so beautiful
circumstances,
situation.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I want to ask you before going into that more, the whole realization in the run-up to this episode was that indeed, like, where is our humanity when we speak about these big issues? Like, how have we come so far that the situation has become so inhumane? And I want to ask you just very simply, like, what the idea of humanity means to you as a doctor, as a mother, as a person, as a researcher. What does it mean to you?
I think that's a very big and beautiful question. To me, humanity means staying connected to yourself. I think every human being that remains connected to him or herself feels the urge to do something when they see injustice or when they see pain in another human being. And I think it's when we disconnect from ourselves that's where we lose that humanity. I don't know who said it, so I'm unable to give the right credits, but whoever deserves them should get them. That said, we can only connect to another human being to the extent that we connect with ourselves. And I think that feels so right, so true and right for me. For me, humanity is something that I feel internally, so it's something in my inside world. And I think it's important to keep your eyes open to that, because that's such an important ethical compass.
Can you maybe describe that, how it is, how you experience it inside you? Just maybe to spark something in all of us as well.
Well, for me, I think it's as simple as just feeling pain when you see another human being living in indignity. That it feels like that's not okay. Maybe that's the most simple way to describe it.
Yeah.
And the reflex is then to want to do something.
Yeah, exactly. So not shutting yourself off from the suffering of another person, or the joy maybe as well.
Exactly. And maybe it's an idealistic idea, but I like to believe that it's in our incapability of dealing with those big emotions that make us shut down to people in need. And I think it would be really beautiful to develop our capacity in staying with our emotions and from that connection with another human being, then doing the right thing.
Yeah. I find it really beautiful what you're saying, also in the sense of, like, if humanity means staying connected close to your own self and through your own self connecting to another, that's also a testimony of how connected we all are, right? How all human beings, if we allow it, that we're so intertwined.
Yeah. I think that's maybe the biggest lesson that this pandemic has brought us is that we are interconnected, and we're all human, and we are all mortal, and we share so many experiences. So, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also worth remembering that the people on this island had the same reflex when the first people arrived in 2015. They collectively helped them. They collectively pulled their blankets out of their houses, and were even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as citizens of Lesbos. So I think it's maybe the most natural thing to do, to want to be there for another human being.
Yeah. And how would you say you practice humanity in your work, or how do you let it come back as a researcher or as a doctor?
That's a good question. I think I try to make my work a tool or a vehicle for that humanity. And on days when I feel stressed or overwhelmed or feel like there's too much work, I try to go back to my inner world and feeling, why am I doing this, and how can I connect to this human being, this other human being, even when it's maybe not as natural, or when it's difficult because of circumstances.
Yeah.
So I always try to go back to it.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, because you've been to Lesbos, indeed, you've worked there as a medical coordinator in the camp, Moria, at that time, which got burnt down, of course. But maybe in your work there, what has been a moment that you experienced a lack of humanity, and maybe a moment where you experienced the opposite of that, deep humanity or compassion? I know I'm asking you very big questions.
No, they're beautiful questions. I think there's one moment that comes to mind when I think of the lack of humanity. I remember one little girl, when I see these children walking here, I think back of her. There was one little girl in our medical clinic, and I think she was about 4 years old, and she had already learned to go to the toilet, so she was already potty trained. And because of all the trauma and stress, she started wetting herself again. And I remember doing the physical examination and noticing so many different infections all at the same time. And I noticed how that's maybe almost, it feels almost mean to say, but how unclean she was. And that felt really inhumane. I thought it doesn't matter how well you explain it, this is not okay, and this feels not right, and this is inhumane.
Yeah.
This shouldn't be the way it is. So that's the moment that I
Comes
think
to mind
of.
first, yeah.
And then I think the most humane experiences, maybe just in the chaos of the situation, in all the problems, you notice all the people really doing their best, not just people living in the camp, but also humanitarians. And you can also say a lot about the humanitarian organizations and NGOs and everything that's going on. But when you look through that, you see a lot of people really doing their best from their capacity, from their knowledge, from their intention. And that's really beautiful to see. I think that's humanity in action, and that's really gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for now. I want to draw in our other guests at the table and connect our humanities together as well and our experiences. First of all, Zimzim, welcome again.
Thank you.
You are an assistant professor of global health and development at ISS, and you're doing research quite close to home for ISS in The Hague. On recent Habesha migrants that have come there during the time of COVID. And Habesha is, maybe not everyone knows, it's from Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's a combination word, if I understand it correctly. So maybe, can you sketch out what life is like for a recent Habesha migrant in The Hague compared to just any old person living in The Hague, especially during this time of COVID?
Thank you, Lynn. The connection to the Habesha, they are called Habeshas, but we may have arguments where some might say like this name doesn't represent migrants from the two countries, but normally when you say Habesha, the two majority of the migrants from these countries associate themselves to this. And while doing the research during the pandemic, there are many things that we learned about the vulnerabilities of recent migrants, which has to do with language barriers, for example, where obviously language is a barrier when you look at it from migrant perspective, but it's not only the language barrier by itself, but this language barrier interacts with other problems. For example, financial insecurities. Recent migrants, they fall under works that have to do with precarity, works that have to do with temporarity, and when they were
what that means is like jobs that are not
jobs
you're not
that
certain you will have them tomorrow.
Exactly,
and they're only temporary.
Yeah, there is temporarity, and then when you can't work anymore because most temporary jobs were shut down, and they were the first to be fired when the pandemic happened, and they don't have savings and finances to fall into or to tap into during that. And there were also situations where parents were not even understanding what was going on at the initial stage of the pandemic. And under normal circumstances, there was the Dutch Refugee Council, where recent migrants can go to in order to translate letters, in order to even have a chat with fellow migrants. That was not happening during the pandemic. And you can imagine the vulnerability that is adding to the anxiety, worriness, and
Must also feel quite
stress.
isolated that you don't have
Exactly.
access to information.
Yeah, and under normal circumstances, there is also the possibility of even interacting with fellow communities at the house level. They can go and visit, but that was not possible. And for the recent migrants, not understanding what was taking place due to all these barriers was adding to the vulnerabilities, adding to the challenge. And when you are a migrant, whether you are a recent migrant or not, there is also worry about your country of origin. And the hearts and thoughts are torn apart between the place you are living and the place where you come from.
Where your family is.
Exactly. And if you come from countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, where the health systems are really weak and there is high tendency of vulnerability that is happening due to other economic problems, you can imagine how that adds to the anxiety and the stress of the recent migrants.
Yeah, exactly. So it's both the economic vulnerability of just losing your job, not having anything to fall back to, the social vulnerability where you explained to me like parents just kept taking their kids to school where there was lockdown and the schools were closed. So as a testimony to the lack of information.
Yeah.
Also, socially, the connecting, having just access in general to.
Yeah, and some it's not only recent migrants. Some were not even understanding what was taking place.
Yeah.
What was at stake, and sometimes they are told to go for a walk, and they don't want to do that because they are scared of contacting the disease, and at the same time, they also to meet people. They also want to interact with people.
Yeah,
and
maybe on that point, because now you've given examples of human vulnerability, but you also have seen examples of human solidarity, maybe or compassion. Maybe you can give an example of that. We also see something behind us here.
Yeah, exactly. There is. Sometimes when we are faced with challenge and vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities and challenge also give rise to some form of solidarity, some form of humanity. And if you see in the screen, what is displayed is one form of solidarity that came or that was initiated by migrants, settled migrants, who were trying to help those migrants that are recent and that have not yet found their foots, that have not yet stepped their foots in the new country. So it is called a help desk, and this help desk was initiated by 4 migrant-led NGOs, and it was these vulnerabilities that gave rise to the 4 NGOs to come together to think about like what we can do in order to support the recent migrants in terms of providing information, in terms of also helping the migrants find ways to address their vulnerabilities. And this is something that is done by migrants for migrants.
Yeah.
So we should also bring to the spotlight such initiatives where under normal circumstances, there is no that attention to such initiatives.
But I like how you describe it. Indeed, the crisis also gives all of us space to show our humanity and show what we can mean for someone else who needs that at that moment.
Yeah, and we also have cross-border solidarity that was happening. You have initiatives like resource mobilization, where those in the diaspora community were mobilizing resources, like it could be money, it could be sanitizers, it could be masks, and they were sending the money, sending the masks and sanitizers to the countries of origin, and they were supporting somehow the fight against the pandemic back home.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for now, Zemzem. This is not the end, but I do want to bring Dika in to take a different vantage point here as well, because Your research is, for a large part, also about the human reaction of people in a country like Indonesia, in this case, on the receiving side, a reaction to this indefinite transit of refugees in the country. And you focused on host societies' kind of emotions and discourses of specifically solidarity and social jealousy.
Yeah.
Solidarity, can you
Among
explain, among others, yeah, maybe there's way more, but can you explain what these responses are and also maybe the tension between them?
I think a bit of context. Indonesia has had a history with refugees since the war in the Vietnam, but now is a host to around 14,000 refugees, which is quite small considering it's a population of 220 million.
Yeah.
But the responses are still quite emotive, despite their small number. There's media attention. There's fishermen villages when Rohingya refugees were stranded, went against government's request not to help the fishermen stranded, and actually brought them onto our borders. So, oftentimes when we talk about refugees, we talk about the management of humans, right? Numbers, who gets to go where, who should be resettled where. But what my research tries to do is show it's actually not just a simple management of people. It's really an emotional kind of response, and the tension that I find in Indonesia, and I'm sure it's not specific to Indonesia, is that on one hand there's a lot of discourse of solidarity, as you mentioned, like fishermen wanting to help refugees, among other people who want to help refugees, but there's also a strong discourse of social jealousy in a context like Indonesia, where interreligious conflict, interethnic conflict between immigrant, not immigrant from abroad, but also a migration within, can spark conflicts, or in islands, or is believed to spark conflict. I mean, when you say social jealousy in the context of Indonesia, you don't even have to prove that it will create conflict.
What is social jealousy compared to
I'm doing a translation from Indonesian. It's so maybe it doesn't fit in English, but in Indonesian you say kecemburuan sosial, and in a context like Indonesia, when you say, "Oh, this will cause kecemburuan sosial," which I've maybe too literally translated to social jealousy, it's enough to either create action or stop action. So, for example, refugees in Indonesia. You said indefinite transit. In the past, they probably only stay in Indonesia for 3 to 4 years before they get resettled elsewhere. But as it's getting harder and harder for them to get resettled, a lot of refugees stay even a decade. People who come as minors become adults, families start. So, it's a life in limbo during that years of transition. They're not allowed to work. Most of the children don't have access to education during those years. And so if you talk to like an Indonesian who knows of the presence of refugees and asks, what is your opinion? Do you think they should be allowed to work? And their response was, no. That will cause social jealousy. I mean, in the sense it's not an affluent society. There's still a lot of problems with poverty. So the mentality of we need to protect us and our people is still very strong. But at the same time, you do see actions of solidarity. You do see people trying to, as you said, like fishermen villages just sharing whatever they have whenever someone gets stranded. So it's not a monolithic response, and it goes. I think the research tries to show that even volunteers who do have this statement of solidarity, there's still points in their actions of volunteering where they also think who deserves and who does not deserve, and why should I help, right?
I think it's a great term, actually, social jealousy. I think it applies to a lot of contexts as well.
Yeah.
It's jealousy that really has the power to block things or make things happen. And you already described a bit about how that emotional human response really affects the reality that the refugees then face, or maybe also the policy.
Yeah, and Indonesia is not a signatory actor to the 1951 convention, and we didn't have any laws
Which
about...
is? For those of us who don't know.
The Refugee Convention of 1951, or its 1967 protocol. But we only have now like a legal framework called the Presidential Regulation number 125 that just was signed in 2016 that recognizes the status refugee. But Indonesia only sees itself as a transit country, regardless of the reality that refugees are living there for decades. It still only sees itself as a transit country.
Right.
So these emotional reactions becomes the tool to create that kind of, to validate that status, but still want to be seen as a good international actor. Like we don't practice non-refoulement. We allow them in, but no government money goes into it. It's all kind of funded. They're mostly financed by IOM.
And we can use the social
UNHCR.
jealousy as the
And
reason
then
to not
exactly.
do that. Yeah.
So while they're only here to transit,
Yeah. But I think maybe my last question for now is like I feel that this happens in a lot of places, right? Or where there's transit of refugees or in host countries where the emotional response that's not even always based on the facts or the numbers. Do you think there's a way to influence such responses? Is there a way to make social jealousy, turn that into solidarity more, let's say?
Well, I don't know if there's like a way to do it, but what I do try in my research is at least allow ourselves to be self-reflective in our responses rather than see refugees or migrants as the problem. I think it's important for us to see or understand where are our emotional, if we're having an emotional response, what does it come from? What prejudices is it, rooted in? What is the fear that they're going to take our jobs? I mean, this exists in Indonesia as well. Is there ground to it, or do they actually create jobs? So I don't think I have a solution per se, but I do want to emphasize the importance of self-reflection in our responses and reactions, and see it as a mirror rather than an objective reality of these people who are moving.
Yeah, exactly. Look at yourself first and why you're reacting in that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of you together, I want to ask you how we've kind of explored this concept of humanity and human responses from different angles, but how do you think we can make humanity more central in policy or in practice? What can we do to base ourselves more on that idea of humanity, or the feeling, maybe the experience? Me and my questions.
Yeah, it's a hard one, right? You want to go first, since you have practice?
Well, I'd like to repeat something that you said that I think is really important, and that's the development of self-awareness, because I think a lot of things that might happen unconsciously or as a reaction to something perceived as a danger, or like it's rooted in fear. And I think only when we become self-aware that we can change that into humanity. So I think that's really essential, working on ourselves and developing that. Yeah.
What I'm struggling with here is, like, I can imagine trying that personally, individually, but how to then do that collectively, as a society, try to organize ourselves more around humanity or solidarity or compassion in this case.
Yeah,
I know for sure we won't have the final answer here, but we can see where we get.
I think there is a possibility for every. I don't want to use the name, the term stakeholder, but we all are. I am specifically targeting the situation we are in. Like, if, for example, the government has some responsibilities, but what we are in cannot be done only by the government. So there are initiatives like the help desk. The help desk can be used as a bridge to reach out to marginalized or migrant type of communities. And even like settled migrants, they have this responsibility. I'm not using the responsibility as literally, but there is also responsibility of settled migrants to help new migrants. Mm-hmm. So everybody has a role to play in order for us to achieve this objective of humanity.
So in that sense, it is individual, and that we're like not sitting back and thinking someone else will do it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really about what can you yourself do to open up yourself again to the reality and the. Yeah, you want to add?
Well, I think it's also important to change how we view movement and migration as well, and at least this is the case in Indonesia, when we keep on calling people transit, it presumes that their life will stop until they either get resettled somewhere else or until, they voluntarily choose to return, right? So
Right.
I think it's also a matter of trying to see and make policies that are more accommodative to life on the move, rather than just like assuming life will continue once people are putting in roots. And I think that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You can continue living even if you're
On the
move.
yeah.
Yeah. One question we have from our audience, from Mentimeter, is I value the solidarity practiced by migrant communities, as reflected in the example by Zemzem. However, how do we hold the state accountable to practice solidarity with migrant communities? So within the migrant communities, the solidarity is there, but how can the state be held accountable to practice solidarity with these communities?
Was that for Zemzem? I'm hoping it's for her.
I am thinking.
It's for whoever feels called.
This is also something that we reflected while doing the research, and there are recommendations that you can make, and the recommendations that came out also while speaking to the help desk as well as to the communities, it was. We need support. We need to be supported by the government, and we need to be acknowledged. And right now, for example, the help desk is almost like they couldn't continue because at first they mobilized resources from their own pocket, but that couldn't sustain longer. So now if these such initiatives have to continue, there is a need for the government also to come in and work with such initiatives.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really about also acknowledging what is already happening, what people are mobilizing themselves and supporting. That.
One good example that I have seen where the government was coming together with the help desk and it is working is targeting this vaccine hesitancy, for example. We hear that vaccine hesitancy is high among migrants. And the help desk is working on why there is high vaccine hesitancy among migrants. Does it have to do with being a migrant? Does it have to do with trust? Does it have to do with religion? So they started addressing the questions and the hesitancy itself. And now we see an increase in vaccine acceptance among the COVID-19 vaccine acceptance among migrant communities. And they do it, it's not only awareness that is only in Dutch or in English, but they are doing the awareness in different languages where they see these problems of vaccine hesitancy. So when the two came together, there is something that could be achieved. So.
Are there any burning questions here in the audience for these speakers? One burning question from the Mr. in the back. Hi. Jamil will come to you. Yeah.
Hello. I'm a bit puzzled with the social jealousy definition. Why do we need a new term when we have xenophobia and racism? Do you think a Rohingya refugee would also call the host Indonesian communities social jealousy as social jealousy, or simply would call it as racism?
Thank you.
Sharp question, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not proposing a new concept or anything. I'm just using the term used by my participants in my researcher who did use the term kecemburuan sosial. So it was kind of through this quote that my article published. I think definitely there is a racialization of refugees, and they're not a homogenous group. In the context of Indonesia, actually, the image of the refugee that gets more racialized is not necessarily the Rohingya refugee. I think it's much easier, actually, acceptance towards Rohingya refugees in the context of Indonesia. It's more actually the Hazara refugee from Afghanistan, which consists of the majority of refugees in Indonesia. There's a racialization in the sense of because they look whiter, and there's a sense of valuing whiteness in Indonesia. They're seen as better than us sometimes, not in explicit sense, you know. It's more implied in the language used when talking about them. Like, for example, when there's rumors about relationships between Hazara refugees, who are mostly men, and Indonesian locals, there's a lot of talk up into the newspaper, so it's not only like everyday talk only, ethnographically collected, but also media reports about, oh, they're here to steal our women. They're here to... So it is definitely racialized, and I think why it's not necessarily xenophobia, it's not looking down on them. It's a fear of someone coming in might become better than us, might take up space that should be ours. And I think that's the emotion associated to it. But I'm not necessarily saying social jealousy should replace any other word. I'm just saying that's the word used in this context. Yeah. And it has a historical, like if you talk about the history of riots in '92 towards Chinese immigrants, Chinese Indonesians, so Chinese descended Indonesians, they also use that term a lot, social jealousy. If you go to see, I mean, if the conflicts between the Muslims and the Christians in some Eastern islands, also the term social jealousy. So it's such a poignant word or term in this context that the saying of it is enough sometimes to create action. For example, organizations that were meant to distribute resources on refugees will make sure that part of that resources go to the local neighborhood to avoid that kind of so-called social jealousy.
Social jealousy.
Yeah, so that
Thanks,
was kind of my meaning.
for elaborating. It's interesting. Yeah. I want to round off our blog and give the last word to Hannah, because I feel you had a thought that you wanted to share.
So I think one point that I really wanted to make is that for me, humanity is not a soft thing. And even if it's soft, it can be very strong too. If you, for example, shift attention of research to people that really need it. So it's not just, when you asked about what can the government do, it's not just asking the government to open their hearts. It's actually asking the government to invest in research, to make, for example, health needs very clear and to base policy on that. So it's not just something that, that is too soft to act on. It's something that is very practical.
Yeah, that you can use to prioritize.
Exactly,
policy. Yeah. Thank you for adding that. I think it's important also for the rest of our discussion today. Thanks, Zemzem, Dika, and Hannah for now. You're still here. We can still ask them questions, but I would like to go to our second block of today. All right. The second block is indeed about policy, the current policy leading to humanitarian disasters. Normally, in an ideal world, you would hope that refugee migration policy responds to humanitarian disaster. Please join me, Thea. Disaster. But right now, as Thea here is signaling, the policies are actually a big cause of humanitarian disasters instead. So Thea Hilhorst, very happy that you're here. Thea is a professor of humanitarian studies at ISS, and you've studied many aspects of humanitarian disasters, conflict, etc. But now I want to focus with you on what I just introduced. So what are the policies and the micro practices, as you call them, that you see leading to humanitarian disaster rather than solving it?
Yeah, hi Lynn, thanks.
Hi Thea.
Well, I think in the frame of today, what is really important is to just realize something about crisis, and that is that we've always considered that crisis follows from a disaster or from a conflict. So people flee away from conflict, people flee away from disaster, and that is why they are in need humanitarian assistance. What we now see is that some of the most dire situations of humanitarian need originate not from a conflict directly or a disaster directly, but from the simple fact that there's a border that people encounter on the way somewhere. And then at that border, we see humanitarian needs evolve to the level of crisis that are really only because that border. That's why we call them humanitarian borders. And it goes with death, sometimes worse than in war. So if you see what is happening, what has been happening with the people who die crossing the Mediterranean, the numbers are really high. I don't know now, but there was a point when I think even 25% or something of people who would cross would die.
Wow.
Now, they haven't been drowned by European leaders, of course. It's not like Mark Rutte went there to keep their heads under the water. But you might say, and increasingly people say now, leaning on Foucault, but also current authors who write about these situations, like David Keane and Michel Auger, who talk about the politics of letting die. So
Politics of letting die.
Politics of letting die. So it's not like proactively killing, but it is sitting back when you know that people will die by your inaction. Now, I'm not saying that these problems are easy to solve. So I don't want to be coming across as if I would say, oh, government leaders, you do everything wrong. Why don't you just simply do this or simply do that? Because it is not simple. But we can all see that the politics of letting die, of inaction by which people, that is not humane. As we were talking about humanity, there's nothing humane about that.
No.
And we all feel like this cannot be done like this. Even though the solutions may be difficult, we have to find them. There's no other choice. How can you just sit back and let people die?
Yeah, exactly. How can you?
Yeah.
How can we?
How can we?
Yeah.
That's the question I would like to put on the table.
Yeah. How can we just sit back and let the politics of letting people die as a way to deter other people from coming?
That is the reason, of course, because many people say, and you think about it when you come to Lesbos, for example. Now, I haven't been there in the last years since the fire, but before that, when I was in Camp Moria, I would compare it to something we call in Dutch an hondenkennel, a place.
Kennel, dog kennel, yeah.
Yeah, where you keep dogs. So it's like gated, and then sometimes piled up. So it's almost if people are sitting in one of those benches.
Yeah.
It's not humane. It's not how people can live. It's not how people can sustain themselves. And then you start to feel maybe this is part of this is because people will write home like, wow, it's so terrible here, don't try to come. So that's the
But is that what happens?
That's the tourist that you talk about.
Is it effective in that way?
I don't even want to know if it is effective.
No, exactly. It's not
it's
even
just
relevant.
Not what you do.
Yeah.
It's like in the Middle Ages, the cities.
Yeah.
They would round up people who are drifting, zwervers. They round up people who drift.
Yeah.
And just for the fun of it, they hang them on Friday. In my town in Utrecht, there were hangings every Friday. It was great fun. After work, you would go to the Neude, and then they would, have some drifting people and hang them. And then in many medieval towns, the heads were then put on a stake outside the city.
Right.
Like, don't come in the city when you're a drifter.
Is that version?
Yeah.
That's like the
But
medieval
that's the
version
Middle
of
Ages,
what we're doing now.
and we don't do that now, we hope.
Yeah.
So I don't even want to know if it's effective, you just
Exactly.
don't do it.
But I also read your work on how, people who do have some human sense in them and are trying to help also get discouraged or even slammed down.
Now, that's the thing, that's where I did my research on. Like, so how, in the midst of this, it's very difficult to maintain your motivation. We just heard Hannah talk about this as well. Like in Lesbos, it's sometimes very difficult to just keep going.
Yeah.
And what we noticed is that aid workers who would be very militant or protesting, for example, the EU-Turkey deal, after 1 or 2 years, they say, no, let's not bother anymore. Why would we even go to the street? Why would we even protest? Nobody's listening to us anyway. We're just sitting here. So they change their goals, and they just try to make things a tiny little bit better for the people who are there, like an extra shower.
Right.
So they at least
Very
can wash
marginal
themselves.
improvements.
Yeah, it's marginal.
But it's important.
But of course, if you are somebody who can then have a shower, it's not unimportant.
Exactly,
because if you live that type of life, small details like that you can wash yourself can become extremely important, because washing yourself, it gives you a sense of being a human being instead of a dog.
Exactly. We have a situation now in Europe at our eastern border, let's say, the border between Belarus and Poland, where it's maybe a schoolbook example of what you call a humanitarian border, the situation that's happening there. We have a very tiny video shot by the Polish police, of all people, from Twitter, just to get a sense of what it is like to walk around there. Yeah, that's just a very small glimpse into what's happening. We have somebody who is right there in Poland working at the border. We have Anna Alboth here. She is the media officer of the Minority Rights Group, and she is now on the border coordinating, collaborating with all the groups that are trying to do something on the ground from a civil society perspective. They've started this collective in August called Grupo Granita. Anna, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
I can't yet see you, but that might also...
She's behind you, but
she's behind me, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Anna, from Poland. I want to ask you very simply, can you explain to us, because you're seeing it with your own eyes, what is happening there at the border of Poland and Belarus?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me here and giving this space to this humanitarian crisis happening right away, right in my country. I'm Polish. I used to work for the last years on all European borders. I've been on the Greek islands and been to Canary Islands. I've been on the Balkan route. And I can assure you, we are having completely different level of crisis now on the Polish-Belarusian border. I really like this sentence I heard just before about politics of letting people die, because this is exactly it. This is the systematic allowing of crisis happening there. Together with 14 different NGOs, at the beginning of August, we decided to join together. We knew what was happening on the Belarusian-Lithuanian border, that people started to cross, that people were brought by Lukashenko.
Can we back up a little bit, because maybe not everyone understands like what happened here? How come those people are stuck there? And I hear it's around at least 5,000 people stuck there now, right?
So 5,000 people are the people we as activists had contact with. These are 5,000 people for sure. We know about much more, but this is something that is in our monitoring database. This is something I can, guarantee you that those people were and are still there. What happened? In May, the leader, the dictator of Belarus, decided to start kind of an artificial refugee route. He let people come with planes to Belarus. This was not a normal way people were getting to Europe. It was well organized and strategically planned. Very well planned. He surprised all of us. People were first brought to the border with Lithuania, and then in August, we Polish activists, we knew that it will be happening also on the Polish border, because as we know, that's how it is when people start to walk. Of course, they will try their ways also on other borders. So from August on, we are monitoring situation. We thought we will be monitoring. We thought we will be there around the border, seeing what is happening, maybe bringing proofs of not the best behavior. Well, Poland surprised us very much, introducing, first of all, the emergency zone, which means few kilometers along the whole 418 kilometers border. Nobody could enter, nobody meaning humanitarian organization, human rights organizations, and media. This is still happening. Nobody can enter this place except people living there who are not allowed to record any sound or voice. Polish government legalized pushbacks within few days. They've just done all the bad lessons that all European countries were learning in the last 6 years. I had a feeling Poland just jumped on the elevator and went, above everybody else. What it means for us activists when we cannot enter the zone, when we can meet people only outside of the zone in the forests. It means people are dying. And I'm not afraid of saying these very strong words. I've never seen anything like this before. I've seen people in very difficult state in the Greek islands, like you mentioned before in the discussion, or in Balkans. But here, we have right now snow in the forest, we have minus temperatures, and we have thousands of people in the forest. Why they are in the forest? When they cross this fence that you just seen on the video, I have to underline that the video you've seen was the video made by Polish authorities. And that's also very important to say, because they also want to show only one side of the story. It's not that Polish authorities are behaving well in this situation. Polish authorities are as violent and brutal as Belarusian authorities, pushing people back, pushing families back, pushing pregnant women back, pushing disabled people back who ask for asylum in Poland. It's extremely important to say that there were situations when I was with a group in the forest, people were begging to apply for international protection, and they would be just packed on the car, and sometimes also divided families are being divided and pushed back on the Belarusian side. On the Belarusian side, you have Belarusian army not letting people move back. So people are stuck between two very violent groups, Polish and Belarusian.
Yeah, and the activists cannot actually even reach them properly to help.
We can reach only some percent of the people.
Some percent, yeah. It's really insane to me. Also, the thought of we've all been like on our high horse about Trump wanting to build his wall, while actually on the eastern side of the EU, we're also just trying to literally build a wall so that people cannot cross. I want to ask you, Anna, because you're there, you know what's needed. What would you say, like in terms of how we're supposed to respond? We can't just sit back and go along in this politics of letting people die. What would be the response that humanitarians and that people there are hoping for?
What we as activists done from the beginning on, we just went there and we are bringing humanitarian aid. We are doing something that big humanitarian organizations should be doing, which means we are going to the forest, hiding from police, from border guards, and from army at night, going with a backpack with warm soup and giving people water. Some people didn't drink for days, giving people food. I met people who didn't eat for 3 weeks, giving people medicine, giving people power banks that they have any chance to be in contact with families, with anybody. We have doctors that go with us, but of course, every next person is additional risk for them to be pushed back. So this is what we are doing. This is something that should be done by big organizations.
Yeah.
First of all, big international organizations should be there. It shouldn't be local people becoming activists.
Yeah.
Second thing is, of course, this is what all European Union, including Polish government, should be doing, is putting sanction of Lukashenko to stop this artificial move of people. Those who are there, those who are on the border and on the Polish side, they should be immediately brought to warm places, be given food, be given access to lawyers. This is what should happen immediately.
Yeah.
But this will not happen without international interest.
Pressure and interest and visibility. Yeah. Thank you for now, Anna. Please stay on the line.
Sure.
I want to bring into this conversation Zeynep Kashli. Zeynep, are you here? Yes. Hi. Yes. Anila, yes, great. Zeynep, you're assistant professor at ISS as well on this theme. And I want to ask you to very briefly sketch out for us, because for some of us, this comes as a surprise. Like, what is happening all of a sudden now at the Polish-Belarusian border, or crisis here, crisis there. But to you, it's more like a cycle, right? It's a cycle of crises happening. So can you explain to us what's actually going on behind the scenes of such a crisis, kind of the historical, the geographical entanglements that produce this result?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for bringing us to this level now, and Anna for the work that you've been doing in you and your team, the work that you've been doing in the last months in Belarusian border. Indeed, this is not the first time, and unfortunately, if it goes like this, it won't be the last. And a lot of opposition groups, democratic forces, pro-migrant groups, every now and then repeats this, right? This is gonna come back again. This is gonna haunt us. And we just saw this last year, right before the COVID pandemic hit Europe. We saw it at the Greek-Turkish border happening, almost in the way that Anna is describing now, actually. It was a similar kind of tragedy. And what I heard when I was in Edirne just last month from authorities, if it wasn't for COVID, it could continue much longer. And they were pretty much determined to actually put the pressure on the EU in the same way that Lukashenko is doing. And why not next time? It might be Finland-Russian border, right? So EU really makes itself hostage to this kind of politics on the other side of Europe, basically, across the border. And why it does this is a definitely deliberate policy choice by the EU. And it of course goes back to the whole EU migration and asylum regime, the construction of it. The reason why we have this is because there is not a system in Europe itself where people can actually come and seek asylum, right? Mm-hmm. And Thea mentioned this, that this is the crisis of the borders. Yes, indeed, this is the crisis of the borders that the whole Schengen and the Dublin system has created, put in place, and externalizing the whole governance of migration and asylum to third countries like Turkey and the West, the East or the South. We see this happening, we saw this happening even before the Turkish EU deal and all the fuss around it. We saw this between Italy and Libya. We saw this between Morocco and Spain. So we have been seeing different cycles of this basically in the last 30 years.
And by externalizing, you mean that the EU does not want to deal with this reality, so they just pay other people off, actually other countries outside the border to deal with it?
Yeah, in the end, people are on the move for various reasons. Those reasons we can discuss in detail, but they are on the move.
Yeah. That's a
and
reality,
then, yeah, it's a reality. And if you want to make it others' problem, this is the way you do it. You can only contain it that long. I mean, they tried every way to contain it in the regions.
Yeah.
But now it's coming here to the home, to the European home. Yeah. It comes as close as it can. And it's obvious it's not going to stop here if the EU doesn't take an entirely different approach to what they understand in terms of mobility, how they see people's right to mobility, basically, everyone's right to mobility.
Yeah, right to mobility, exactly. Could I have all three of you ladies with me online, and Thea, all four of you, Zainab, Anila, Anna, and Thea. Anila, first of all, I'm just very curious to hear from you what stands out for you from this discussion so far.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you so much. I will, connect the discussion also, which we heard from the first panel and here, and what come up again and again is about human dignity. It's about how we are using the humanitarian, all perspectives, all theories when we are talking about humans, when we are talking about how we save them. But unfortunately, when it comes in the policies and they're thinking about, okay, we need to save people, but instead of saving people, they are saving their borders. Mm-hmm. Because the perspective, the image, when we talk about refugee, what we feel, image comes to our mind about people who are in need, who are looking for rescue, who are looking for some support. Even when we see the video shared by you earlier, we only stick with those images and we think, okay, there are so many humans are coming as a threat, which happened in 2015 and 16. The crisis of so far refugees come up, and this image come as a fear to the policies, and which recent incidents are happening right now in Belarus. They are weaponizing this fear as a human weaponizing, and they're using this triggering fear, and they are very much clever, and they are putting this fear on the border of the Europe right now. And instead of saving people, they are trying to save their borders.
Using people in the process.
Yes, yes. And the day before yesterday, even European Commission, they also, released information about how we not let these people to come in because they do not want Belarus to use humans as a weaponized threat. But the thing is that who's at risk? These are human beings. They are children. They are women. We really need to unpack and to think about, we are talking about human. And when we are coming to the humanity, don't let them die, as Tia also mentioned. Don't let them fail. But unfortunately, so far, we are in 2021, almost in the end. This recent crisis of Afghanistan, this recent crisis of Belarus, they are just replacing one crisis with other crisis. And in a forced migration, people on the move always happened, and it will gonna happen. Even the crisis we're gonna see in climate change, we can't stop that. We don't know what happened in Netherlands in the upcoming years, and what will we do?
Exactly.
This is really important when we are talking about mobility. We're talking about human beings and how we make them first, and how we can make human rights approach. Because
embrace the reality. Can I I want to bring everyone else back here because you're raising something important. Indeed, it's a reality. It's not going to go away, obviously not. But we have now this word of routinized emergency stood out to me. Routinized emergency. The emergency has become a constant, right? The crisis is there forever, and sometimes, actually all the time, we're just being indifferent to it. So the people that are not on the move, let's say. And the governments are indeed protecting their borders instead of what we should be doing is protecting the human beings that we're talking about. So the question is, how can we replace this strategic indifference and get to action instead?
You're looking at
I'm looking at all of you, yeah.
Oh. Well, I think many things can be done, but it's not a thing. You know, it's not like let us flip policy and now we do it differently and we turn this into that.
No.
Because we also have to realize that these are not easy issues. I think, first, lots of movement today, and we talk about this. There's Afghanistan, there's Syria, there's Yemen, and those are people who cannot move. That's even worse. They are just locked inside their country, being hungry. So what is in common there? It's conflict. So even though there are many reasons why people move, one of those reasons consistently is because of unsafety and conflict. So every single effort that can be made internationally to stop those conflicts is a big help for everything. And it's really a root cause of much of the migration is that there's conflict and physical unsafety for people.
Yeah.
Even then, there may be many more people who want to come to Europe than Europe can handle. And it is a fact that you cannot just, well, it's a fact. It's something that I think it's not realistic to think that we can just throw away the border. Let's throw it open, everybody welcome. It's not going to work.
Because?
I don't think it's working because that might just be creating too much tension, and there's a reachability of how many new people can come to a country in terms of, simple things like housing and things like that. But in between that situation of an open border and the current situation is a huge, huge gap. And in the Netherlands, my country talks simply about if every neighborhood of 1,000 people, can they not handle one extra person? That would up the people we can welcome in the Netherlands. We are suddenly talking about 70,000 people that we can bring to the Netherlands. And that's not the numbers we think about.
Yeah.
Our government will think and fret for 3 weeks whether they can perhaps bring 300 people, or 500. But it's a ridiculous number if you see how big we are. Same for the whole of Europe. So there's so much in between just throwing up open everything and being so restrictive as we are today. There are so many grey policies that can be done. And then the reception, it can be so much more humane. As Anna says, it's unacceptable that people have to sit in a forest and be so cold and can't sleep and can't eat and can't drink. I mean, that cannot happen at our border.
No.
Is this a matter of not wanting that to happen?
Yeah. Zeynep and Anna, I would like to hear your last thoughts on this. How can we move away from this routinized emergency, this constant disaster that we're, for some insane reason, accepting right now? How can we move away from accepting that at all?
Maybe I go first. Well, I was using this routinized emergency in the blog that I wrote.
Yeah, that's where I stole it from.
Last year, indeed, frustrated with what was going on at the Greek in Lesbos at the time. Indeed, I was also there referring to Rohirwa and Reikum's discussion on this about the moral side of the whole issue, that it is such a routine that we don't care anymore. We morally don't feel obliged even to react to it to a great extent. And what it does, this routinized emergency does, is really helps consolidating this politics of inaction. And the only way to counter this is to actually discuss more the right to mobility, even though this doesn't necessarily have to end in open borders. Exactly, there's 50 shades of gray between the two. And there's always other routes that we can discuss, right? Different ways to increase legal migration channels, how to cope with resettlement issues, relocation issues, or settlement in the region, all of that. But when you look at the language that is really consolidating through routinized emergencies, especially since the EU-Turkey deal 2015, because that was the time when the new pact with the idea of a new approach started. And then last year it was presented as 5 years after the first attempt. We see the track that it is on. The track is really just putting smuggling at the center of the whole thing. And as Anila also mentioned, the border, protection of the borders. And that's what we heard from the case in the Polish-Belarusian border now. There's not anymore even disunity among the EU members. There was, at least when there was a Greek-Turkish crisis, there was still not a unitary voice. But what we see over the years through these routinized emergencies, that EU member states now consolidated almost their view on the fact that they have to protect their borders. And that's why the whole rhetoric has been really has to be shifted 180% by putting right to mobility at the center stage of the discussion. And then we can restart the conversation, because if we keep on talking from the perspective of the state borders instead of human security, but the state security, we cannot get out of this loop. And we are already on the track to make it this even more deadly. And anything that will come out of this is going to be a new iteration of exactly the same thing.
I want to ask, Thea, I would like to respond to this very briefly.
No, I want to add something, and that is, it is true when you say, Zeynep, we don't care, but we do care. You're talking about the governments, and then I totally agree with everything you say. But one of the things that should happen first is that European governments should listen to European people.
Yeah.
I just read last week, there was a very wonderful, interesting research from Sweden. And they did a really solid research in 16 European countries, I believe. And they had big surveys. People in Europe are overwhelmingly agreeing that there should be a proper European migration policy. Secondly, people in Europe are by far majority saying that they should have more refugees and adopt them in the country rather than paying other countries to take them. This research was done all over Europe. In the West, the majority was very big.
Yeah.
But also in Eastern Europe, there was still a majority of people who said we want more refugees. So we do care. That's the irony.
Yeah.
The majority of people in Europe cares. But it's the governments, and I cannot see all governments. I don't know all the dynamics in every country, but I see it in the Netherlands, that our government is leaning its ear to the extreme right. That's where they're afraid of. That's where they feel maybe votes will go to. And that's a minority of people. And they all hang their ears to that minority and say, oh, there is no constituency for migrants. It's not true. If you ask people in the Netherlands, 60 or 70% want us to do more for refugees.
Nice, yeah. That's a very important addition. Anna, I want to ask you, as someone, the embodiment of someone who definitely cares and who is definitely putting herself out there, what last thought would you like to leave us with?
Well, you know, after this month of seeing such an incredible hunger that I was only reading about in my life, I've never seen anything like this. I have a feeling that we all should answer ourselves in Europe this question. When we talk about human rights, are we talking about rights of European humans or of all the humans? Because everything what we are doing, I mean, we, governments, European Union, would be giving the opposite answer. And maybe let's just stop, you know, lying to ourselves that we do something else. And one more thing, in 2015, when so many people arrived to Europe, together with my family, we invited 3 refugees to our house for 2 years. And it was the best decision I ever done. It was the biggest lesson, but also a big lesson learned of what works and what doesn't work in terms of bringing people inside of the society, both directions. And the same is happening now on the Polish-Belarusian border. A lot of local people who've never had contact with anybody from outside, who was 3 months ago afraid and had a million questions, suddenly when they met in front of their house somebody hungry who needed help, you know, they got their answers. They don't have doubts anymore about it. And if we all, on the human level, if we can have those lessons, I'm sure that on the higher levels of politics, there can be also lessons learned that we can implement for a better Europe.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that. How are we doing here after this? Everyone is dead silent. Yeah, thank you, ladies. Our next block is all about moving forward from where we have landed now, this state of extreme humanitarian embarrassment for us all, I would almost want to say. So thank you for the speakers in this block for now. As a little, to open our minds to this new thinking, we have a little intermezzo for you by the lovely Jamil.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. And I would like to welcome all of you to a little virtual exhibition. And I feel very honored today to present the works of a dear friend of mine, Adesokan, who is a very talented artist from Lagos, Nigeria, currently based in the Netherlands. And with his series, Waste Identity, he explores the relationship between waste and identity. And he actually uses waste as a metaphor for displacement and human migration. But before we have a look at all of the images that are part of this series, I would like to read out a quote from the artist himself. As an individual, I cannot move as freely as the waste I generate. We are in a reality where our waste travels the world freely, without being subject to scrutiny or suspicion. My waste identity allows me endless movement. It allows me privilege to move. Perhaps in embodying this identity, the world will be fluid and permeable to me. I can go anywhere and everywhere, traveling far and wide, to the remotest places, unchecked, unhindered. Now I would like us all to take a moment and have a look at these beautiful works. So this shows a drone footage of a waste landfill site in Lagos, Nigeria. And this series has been created through active exploration of these environments. And what we see in these environments is that there are a lot of local settlements. So people creating their own communities, their industries, and a lot of them, or a lot of these settlements arise as a result of displacement. And these photos are all part of the Passports for Plastic Waste collection. And with this collection, he really shows the deep global inequalities in movement. So you see here plastic actually taking on a human identity through passports. And in this way, Adeshokan shows through his art that we live in a world where human migration is inhibited by borders, while waste moves freely. It goes everywhere and anywhere. Can we do better than that? Over to you, Lynn.
Can we do better than that? Let's start our third block. All right. We're still so silent. Everyone's kind of frozen in the moment.
Just awestruck by Anna's stories and some of the other stories.
Yeah, definitely true. I definitely feel that. But I do want to warmly welcome you, despite the frost. Wies Maas, I'm going to introduce you properly in a bit, but you're the International Program Manager for Vluchtelingenwerk. I'll say the English title in a second, but I think a lot of us here know what Vluchtelingenwerk is. Then we have Nanneke Winters, Assistant Professor in Migration and Development at the ISS. Welcome to you as well, Nanneke. Thea is still with us. Zainab is still with us. Anila is still with us. So there's some people floating around us virtually. And all of you as well. I really think we need all our brains for this one. So, Wies. We started with kind of the small, the human size, the idea of humanity, and then we spoke about policy, the consequences of our current policy, especially in Europe. Now let's zoom out for a second and see the bigger picture with you. And you are an ISS alumna, I know, because I was right there with you studying. And from there, you made a highly impressive round through policy, through civil society, as a civil society liaison at the UN Summit for Refugees and Migration in New York. I saw you there as well. As an advocacy consultant working for both the Global Compact for Migration and that for refugees. And now currently, as we said, at the Dutch Council for Refugees, which is Vluchtelingenwerk. Did I summarize that well? Great. So you've seen a lot of it. So maybe when I look at these figures, it's interesting, but can you highlight for us some of the key figures that we see when it comes to the bigger picture of refugees and migration?
Yeah, thanks for that warm introduction, Lynn, and thanks for having me at this round of discussion. When we talk about migration and refugees and displacement, we always talk about crises, that there is a global displacement crisis, which obviously there are loads of crises, and we've heard the stories throughout this debate already. But I always think it's good to put it in perspective that not the whole world is on the move, and not all movement is forced. So the numbers we see up here are the trends of forced displacement only, so refugees. And the numbers are big and on the rise, and they're too big, and we should address this. But it's still less than 1% of the world population who is forcibly displaced.
Less than 1%, yeah.
And out of these people, half of them, and it's the Yemen crisis, they referred to this, but half of them are actually stuck inside their own country, so there's internal displacement. We tend to create this impression that the whole world is on the move. There's all this narrative about floods of people coming to Europe, but actually it's less than 1% of the world population that's forcibly displaced. And when you look at migration more at large, I think the numbers are currently about 3.5% of the world population, which means that still 96 or 97% of people are actually living in the country that they were born.
Yeah.
And then I think what's important to also address is that displacement is very unequally divided over the world. So both in terms of where refugees and forcibly displaced people are coming from, there's 5 countries that produce over half of the refugees. So that's Syria, that's Venezuela, and a couple of other countries.
5 countries produce half of refugees. Wow.
And most of these people are actually hosted in developing countries, so countries that themselves are already struggling to facilitate for their own local populations, and they are by and large hosting the majority of refugees. In the Netherlands, and a lot of other European countries, there's a lot of debate about the protection in the region. I think Thea can speak about this as well. like it's not happening, but actually 73% of people are based in the neighboring countries, and not everyone obviously by choice. It's also because they don't have the means to move on, because there are very little legal ways to move on. Resettlement is one of them that I hope we'll talk about in a bit. But there's also a lot of people that choose to stay closer to home because of cultural reasons, language reasons, because they hope that the reason why they left a country might soon be over and they move back. It might be because they still have land or resources in the country that they came from. So I think it's just always good to bring in some numbers just to put things in perspective.
For sure.
Not to downplay that there are a lot of crises for the people that are forcibly displaced, but to put it in perspective, and also to realize that if countries would work together a little bit more, we could solve this. There's so much room for solidarity sharing.
Exactly. That's a key word that keeps coming back. I feel solidarity sharing, you're saying. Can you explain what you mean by that? And also how that could be the basis for actual policy and practice, so that it's not just like something we find important to be, like solidarity as something we value, but how can it be the basis to actually move forward?
So we do talk a lot about solidarity sharing. I think in policy speak or government speak, we also talk about responsibility sharing, which from a policy perspective is quite important to say that governments are responsible to protect human rights. It's not only this sort of vague concept of humanity or solidarity. They are actually responsible to protect people, not their own citizens, but people that are within their borders or want to get within their borders. And there's human rights treaties that we have for this. Then government and policymakers also tend to talk about burden sharing, which is something that we as civil society prefer to stay away from, because we never want to frame people as a burden. But you do understand it if you are in Lebanon and 1 out of 4 or 5 is someone with a refugee background, and you as a country are already struggling economically. You do understand that a country like that wants to talk about burden sharing with other governments, and there's countries in Africa that have been hosting refugees for decades and decades without other countries really stepping in to maybe share a bit of resources, but resettlement numbers are crazy low. So that's just the terminology: burden sharing, responsibility sharing, solidarity sharing. I think solidarity is the concept that we need to look at when we wanna do better at protecting refugees, both in terms of quality, in terms of having better asylum procedures, actually allowing people into our countries and into our asylum procedures. What we do now is we close our borders, but if you make it in, then you might get protection. But most people can't make it in. If we would come up with systems that have actually worked in the past. There's been the Indochina crisis a very long time ago, where a couple of countries came together and said, okay, sure, we will resettle this group of people. The numbers are doable. It's something that Thea just shared, 1 out of 1,000 in a neighborhood. The Netherlands resettles 500 people a year. Last year was 400. On paper, in practice, it was even less, because we had a crazy political trade-off. That is really bizarre. If you're doing resettlement anyway, which is really helping the most vulnerable refugees that are stuck in camps or in cities and can't move on with their life in the places where they are, those numbers, we, as a global community, as governments, could easily step up. If you have a system anyway for 500, you could easily do it for 10,000, and that would not be a burden on our society. Of course, you need to look at where are people going to live, where are kids going to be able to go to school. You need to have a system in place for that, but we can easily do that.
Scale that up. If we're talking about 500, might as well. And that in combination with the facts, that is less than 1% of people are on the move in a forcible way. We could pull that off, you would expect. Do you have any? You already came up with an older example, but do you have any current inspiring practices that you see where you see like, aha, those people are doing it right? That's solidarity in practice.
So perhaps maybe a bit more generally, what I think are inspiring practices are practices where different groups in society get together to campaign for a certain group or for certain protection. So an example that's up the screen now is something that we as the Dutch Council worked on last year together with a whole group of other NGOs, a lot of citizens from around the Netherlands, to do a petition to at least relocate a couple of kids from the Greek islands as a start to then show that relocation works, that we can take people out of this horrific situation on the islands and get them into a proper asylum procedure in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries. So as NGOs, it's quite obvious that we do this maybe. But in this case, we also work together with a lot of municipalities, and over half of the municipalities spoke out and said, yes, we're ready to welcome these kids. There's no problem. We have the facilities
at the local level, we can do it.
So there's plenty of these kind of examples across Europe, but across the world, I should say, but I work on Europe the last few years, where mayors, local municipalities step up and say, yes, our cities are open for people, to host people. So I find that inspiring examples of solidarity in practice. Other examples, a few years ago, this is way before this crisis struck in Afghanistan last summer, we campaigned to make sure that Afghan interpreters that had worked with the Dutch forces in Afghan would actually have access to protection in the Netherlands, because they didn't as a group. We then partnered up with a military union. Basically, the military union was defending their colleagues that they'd worked with in Afghanistan who would now not get protection in the Netherlands. So these are, I think, always really inspiring examples where not only us NGOs, it's our role to speak out, to expose, to give voice to what's happening on the ground, where we partner up with other partners in society to show that solidarity is possible.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that for now. Nanneke, you've researched the role of mobility, immobility in people's lives in a very intriguing example I find, which is a form of south-south migration, where African migrants transit through Central America, possibly to get to the US. Can you share a couple of key insights from your work?
Yes, thank you, Lynn. The research started out as focusing on African migrants who currently travel Central America on their way to North America. But of course, along the way, they encounter others as well, including the Venezuelans that were just mentioned, and Haitians, for example, but also people from Bangladesh and Nepal. So there are different people on the move in this region. And what we see when we look at this from a journey or trajectory perspective, so not only looking at the place they come from and the place they go through, but rather at the, what happens while they travel, we see that they get illegalized, racialized, categorized along the way, which means that sometimes they can move in legal ways and sometimes in illegal ways, and this changes. And so this is an important insight because it shows how much this categorization is also a political choice, right? And you can also make another choice.
As in, if you call somebody a refugee, or if you call somebody illegal, or if you call...
Yes, that too. So you see that this changes along the way.
Right. What they are,
and then exactly, and then how they are treated, and what their possibilities for moving are, and the basic fact whether they will survive a journey or not. Yeah. So this is one of the key insights.
I mean, it's quite commonsensical as well if you think about it. That someone's not just like, okay, I'm going from A to B, but there's a whole journey in between, and there's a lot that the person encounters. How, if we would really understand this better through research like yours, how could that help us improve policy practice, how we respond to people on the move?
Well, that's a difficult question, of course, but I think from our research we see maybe two main things. One of the things is the involvement of the communities that people pass through, and it has been mentioned a lot already at this table. The themes of solidarity, for example. But when people get stuck in certain places and they stay there for longer, you see there are interactions, right? And, life happens even if you are stuck somewhere. And this means that migration is not just about people who are moving, but also the people along the way.
Yeah.
And if we do not take their preoccupations, their concerns seriously,
yeah,
I think the basis for solidarity is can be very thin and can also turn into something else.
Right.
And
yeah. Interesting.
This depends very much on context, of course.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention, since you asked about, okay, how can we learn from this, right? In terms of policy and practice, I think if you take this journey perspective, it's very clear to see that this whole deterrence policy, the whole policy of trying to stop people from going somewhere, is not working.
No.
Because you see, as you follow people, you see how much they, maybe that's not the right word, how much they are prepared to suffer, but how much they do and continue to do. So the fact that a border is closed will not stop this from happening.
Yeah.
It will not stop this human suffering.
Yeah.
And I think this is very important to take away. It is actually already known, right? But somehow it does not come across that it does not work. It does not work in Europe. It does not work in the US, nor in Australia, to name some of the places, right, that use other countries to solve their border problems.
Exactly. So policymakers, by holding on to this assumption that you can actually deter people, are creating, well, knowingly creating, just unacceptable situations like the one that we just described as well in Poland, Belarus. I want to bring back Anila. Anila, are you with us?
She is.
Yes, great. Anila, I think one important thing that I want to ask you is, we've been talking a lot about, what governments should do and how people are responding and how, but the one group that is missing often in creating these policies or sketching out the way forward is the refugees themselves. And you are working to change that. You're you are personally changing that as well. But can you say something about how is it possible that we're overlooking the most important voice here in how we create policy in the environment? And what could we do to change that?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me, right?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, okay, good. I'm just making my voice is heard before I say anything. This is a very important question for us because being in this debate and about talking about this discussion, it's like we're hearing this again and again, become like a practice. We are talking about refugees, we are talking for refugees, but we are not listening to refugees maybe. We really need to understand a meaningful way. So as an advocate of refugee representation, to be involved in the policy discussion, I'm part of Global Refugee-Led Network, where actually with the Global Compact of Refugees, we are influencing and we are involved. And actually, next week, we're going to be invited participate in a high-level official meeting, which is happening in Geneva. And we are giving meaningful participation, what we as a refugees want as a solution, when it's about resettlement or complementary pathways, about education, about integration, or about rights of movement. Because it's not a rocket science, it's a very easy thing. It's similar, I always say, if you are talking about gender equality and women's rights, and women are not there, it means you are not doing in a right way. So we as a refugees, we are advocating nothing about us without us, and we are trying to, it's how it helps, why it is important to be involved, because if we are not part of this circle, we are missing the main wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm sure we are on the part of discussion tables, we have a proper seat with dignity, and we involve in an equal partnership.
Yeah. And I know that you need to go in a few moments, but I do want to ask you how, on top of this, nothing about us without us, how can we successfully also apply a feminist lens to that? Because I know that's your thing. Mine too,
yes,
by the way.
Indeed. Thank you. No. I think we become, being a activist myself, coming from a country like Pakistan, is something very much in line. I can't even do everything what I am doing right now because women in this debate is still missing, even in Europe. And it's such big shock for me coming from a developing country like Pakistan when I saw that there's a gender lens is missing, and on top of that, intersectional lens is missing. How we make sure when we are talking about any solution, we keep this solution according to the people, according to women, according to LGBTIQ community, according to disabled people. The gender, age, and diversity lens has to be there, and we are advocating, and let's see how much we can succeed.
Very interesting. I want to bring us all in here because we've heard a lot, and it's not easy indeed. It's complex, but the need, the urgency is so clear. Like however complex it might be, you're going, Anila. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
However complex it might be, if we indeed want more durable action, more systemic, also in a way that brings different parties together, more humane, especially. What do we feel are most like maybe the instruments that we have? You mentioned resettlement, for instance, Wies, but also maybe the things that we have not, that are not on our in our collective minds in terms of how we could move forward from this in a way that we wish we would have done yesterday. Thea, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were looking at Zeynep.
I'm looking at seeing who bites.
Well, I totally agree that solidarity is very often interpersonal. It's from people to people. And if we have that opportunity to do things from people to people, it is actually eye-opening very often. So I like your examples, Wies, and I also like to mention that we now have increasingly families in the Netherlands that open their house for 3 months through, I love that word, care B&B. It's not Airbnb, but care B&B.
Take care B&B, yeah.
So those kind of small things are important, but we still need big things too. And I think the policies that are so complex, if European governments would really let it sink in, that their constituency, their populations are more inclined to help refugees than they are, that should make a difference. At some point, they should be able to say, okay, we can do more. What more is, how it exactly looks like, is very difficult to see. And at the moment, of course, from their point of view, the policies are working because there are fewer people coming to Europe, no matter the cost. So if they gloss over the cost, they really feel like, oh, wow, our policies are more or less working. So it is all the time showing that they're not, and at the price what it takes and the cost that it brings and the people who die on the way and the people who are sitting there in camp. In Lesbos, for example, I hear that there are now very few people arriving. And that is because of the pushbacks. And because they are being directed to Belarus, probably. But it's a fact of life that many policymakers now think, oh, that's great. There's actually very few people, it's worked. So we need to do a lot of work to tell them, like, what you think is working is not working. It's not sustainable. In the end, you make such dirty hands. You don't want to do that. And you have to be careful. I like that word, solidarity sharing, as well. Very good, very good.
Nanneke.
If I may jump in.
Yes, you may.
Just said, I mean, maybe in some place, right, they're not arriving, but they will be arriving somewhere else. This is actually one of the reasons why you see an increase in African migration across Central America, because, it's so hard to get to Europe, for example. It's not the only reason, but it is one of the reasons. And I think what is very important is to, take a broader view of migration, not only a problem of migrants and refugees, but of, it's something that affects societies, not only those of origin and destination, but also societies in between. I think we need to take people's marginalization or feelings of displacement, even when they are staying at home, seriously. Because
can you say that in normal people words?
Yes. Well, if people feel displaced at home, it means that they do not feel at home anymore. They feel their opportunities taken away. They feel marginalized in their own communities, in their own countries.
Yeah.
Stuck. Yeah.
Stuck. Yeah.
Exactly. And this it makes it very difficult to build policies that are sustainable. One example that I came across in my field work was that in a certain portion, or in a town in the Darien region, which is the jungle between Colombia and Panama, where migrants need to pass through if they take that route, is that people have been promised for a very long time a local hospital, which is very much needed in that region, which has been under construction for many, many years. And then, well, it never happens, of course, but then suddenly the government needs to deal with an increased number of migrants for several reasons, and then they're talking about a migrant center of several $1 million.
Yeah.
So of course people will not accept that, and there will not be a sustainable solution for attending to the needs of people on the move, because they feel marginalized themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, indeed, yes, people are social creatures and they do want to help, especially when it touches them personally, but I think there's structural problems in the societies that people pass through or that they go through that also need to be addressed. We cannot do these things
simultaneously. Exactly. Yes. Visha had some thoughts that you were just noting down.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things talking from civil society perspective, some of the things we do, we should continue doing. So we should continue to expose human rights violations. We should continue to give voice to refugees and migrants stuck in horrific situations, but maybe also voice to all those people that are succeeding or that are making it. I mean, there's lots of positive stories to tell as well. We should continue to basically keep up faith in humanity by providing basic humanitarian care and need there where governments are failing. And we should, I think, speak out even much more forcefully than we're doing at the moment, showing that there in a lot of countries, at least in Europe, there is still a majority of people who are willing to host refugees. Even in Hungary, the percentage is, I think, 57% or something that are willing to host refugees. In the Netherlands, it's up to 80%. But I think one thing that would be good to look at a bit more, maybe there are two things. So one of the things we at least really want to focus on in the next few years or the next few months going forward is to really look at those governments, maybe municipalities, that are willing to move forward. Because we tend to focus on the countries that don't want to do anything and just want to keep their borders shut, whereas there are countries, even in Europe, I mean, Portugal is an example, there might be hope for the new German government to be willing to make a much bigger, let's say, gesture. So one thing we really want to focus on within Europe, but maybe also more globally, is to create coalitions of willing governments that are willing to take the first step, to step up their resettlement numbers. That's one. And in the European context, very important to relocate people out of these border situations that are completely unnecessary.
Can you explain why resettlement was such a crucial thing for you to come back to?
Well, I mean, resettlement is a way to prevent people from having to take those really dangerous journeys that
Can you say what it is?
Oh, sorry. So resettlement is people that have already left their country of origin and sought refugee protection mostly in neighboring states, but can't stay there because they have specific vulnerabilities or because there are just too many refugees in those countries. So there's Syrian refugees in Jordan or Somalian refugees in Kenya. There's plenty of groups, Rohingya refugee groups who can't all be hosted in Bangladesh.
Sure.
So resettlement is basically people that are already recognized as refugees, mostly by the UN Refugee Agency, to bring them to a safe place where they can start rebuilding their life. So they're no longer stuck in a limbo temporary situation. So that's resettlement. And relocation pertains to people who have not yet gone through a procedure of getting refugee status, so they're still asylum seekers, so to say, to relocate them out of the situation where they are to a safer situation where they can have a proper asylum procedure.
Indeed, it makes a lot of sense.
And maybe,
go ahead.
That's the thought I was on. The other thing I think we should really look at is who are our allies in speaking out? Because as NGOs or maybe as researchers, we're sort of the usual suspects speaking out, but who can be our voices and vehicles exposing stories, but also looking at solutions. So I've mentioned earlier mayors, but I think also filmmakers and artists and maybe celebrities even have an important role to speak out. That
culture makers.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
You, Lynn.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I would love to. Zeynep, can I ask you to reflect briefly on what opportunity you see that we have in our hands?
Well, I can't agree more with what has been said already, actually. I think indeed the coalition of the willing is now, at least we have enough in our hands of good examples, right? Good practices. So why not really bring them together and make it multiply? So definitely it's important to make this more the narrative, the public narrative. Like it's not the minority, but the majority actually, but it doesn't get the space in the public discussion. So that allyship will definitely help recenter the public debate. That's for sure. It's a necessary step. And I also appreciate thinking about how we can increase the numbers of resettlement, relocation, all of that. But if we also want to talk about systemic changes, it's important to really reflect, and that goes to the question that Anna left us with about the human rights of all, or human rights for us. Because it boils down to that at the end of the day. When we talk about communities where people pass through, when we talk about communities who host newcomers, if we're also talking from that perspective, we must also reflect on what we mean by their way of life, right? That we are trying to protect here or understand and accommodate. Yeah. Because what we hear most of the times is, for sure from the European leaders, that's what we hear when they say, we are a household, right? We are together in this. And then we, in this way, they also stress that this is the European way of life that we are trying to promote. Not protect, but promote. What is it, that European way of life that we are trying to promote? Let's talk about that. But the discussion is never about that. Mm-hmm. Discussion is just about the threat. Right? Yeah. So maybe starting talking about these indeed good practices and the coalition of the willing and all of that will bring us to that next step, which is really the necessary discussion that we need to take if we want a real systemic change out of this. Because in the end of the day, what we're all talking about here is about global inequality. That's why people are on the move. There is no hospital there and people are complaining about it. I mean, this is really about global distribution of wealth, right? Yeah. And then that is what we are trying to protect here. And when we talk about our borders, let's be honest about what we are protecting here. So if we don't really tackle the whole global inequality question, and then what is it that we are protecting by protecting our borders, it will be just really putting a band-aid on the problem. It will just postponing the real systemic discussions that we need to take.
Yeah, very, very core points. I want to bring in in our last minutes actually, a few questions that I got from the audience. I don't know if any of you also sent in questions, but one of them was for Thea. When countries choose this policy or the politics of letting people die, are there any factors or diplomatic issues, instruments that can be used to negotiate otherwise, is the question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I must say, I have even difficulty to say it, the politics of letting die, because I know that nobody wants to see himself, herself as doing it. It's a consequence. It's not the intention, but it's a consequence. Now, one of the things I really always find a paradox is that we seem to separate the politics of the heart and the politics of the head. I know you speak with your heart because you want to take over refugees, but if you think with your head, but I do think with my head, and then I think even the most cold-blooded, rational politicians should understand that the politics of resettlement are extremely important for their own country. Because if you don't do more resettlement, by the end of the day, the countries that we are counting on to host refugees, that is Jordan and those kind of places, the countries in the region, their patience is draining out. They say at some point, well, you can say that you want us to take care of the refugees in the region, that's fine, but if you don't resettle, we don't believe you anymore. And then, we might as well. So it is actually the politics of the rationality to be more sustainable and more future-oriented about these kind of things. Because as Zeynep is also saying, I mean, by doing what we do today, we honestly sow the problems of tomorrow. And they will come back and haunt us. Yeah. So it's just smart politics to do something about it today. It's just smart.
Long-term politics, exactly. Are there any last burning questions here in the audience that we can briefly answer? 2 of them. Maybe we can hear both of them and we can combine them. Hive mind. Do you want to share your question?
Yes. Can I wait for a mic?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, you are talking about humanity and solidarity. And as I understood that in Greece, it's prohibited to help refugees now. Mm-hmm. And this is something, very severe. And I think, what can we do about it? Because, I mean, that sounds like the end of humanity, or...
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. What could one or the politics or organizations like yours do about this? Well,
thank you.
Know. Is there anything we can do about it?
Let's hear the second question.
Which is very related to your question.
I was hoping so.
My question is that you have talked about a lot of action from a government and also the civil societies and academics and I don't really hear any example or even mentioning of the business community. So can you share some of your thoughts around what business could do to be part of this movement? Because, what I heard is there are many businesses, when you talk about the political issues or anything to do with the religious, or they want to stay neutral. So what could they actually do to be part of this movement? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to respond? Please. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, there's 1,000 things. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's something that we didn't address all that much, but that I do think is a very dangerous trend in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, and that is indeed the criminalization of humanitarian work and the criminalization of NGOs, basically helping migrants or refugees. So this is not only, it's not entirely true that just helping refugees is prohibited, but there are certain actions that are increasingly being criminalized, and people are then being put through court cases because they are supposedly guilty of human smuggling, for example. That's what's happening a lot. In Hungary, this is happening. In France, this has happened. And in Greece, this is happening. Italy. So that's not a one-off. It's a trend, and it's dangerous, I think. What we can do is expose it, because not a lot of people know it. What we can do is try to bring this to court. So that's what we're doing a lot with local NGOs. We try to bring court cases to, first of all, national courts, to show that this is not in line with national law, with human rights treaties. And then we bring it up to the European level. But these are really long processes. But that's definitely something. So it's legal action, it's exposure, and it's also trying to work with political parties in those countries to change those policies. So that's what we've done a lot with an Hungarian partner working in Hungary to try to go through parliament to basically turn around these policies. But it's hard, but necessary. And in terms of the business community, there are actually interesting examples of businesses getting together to step up their role, not so much in refugee protection, that might not be a role of businesses, but to show that refugees, displaced people, are people with skills and talents and ambitions that can actually fulfill labor needs. So there are quite a lot of companies who are together in a network, and I forget the name now, but I can get back to you on that, who are showing that they are willing to create places for refugees to work. In a lot of different countries. This is happening in Turkey, in the United States, in Greece. But the business community traditionally is quite hesitant to be very vocal about this because they're afraid that would harm their business chances. So I think there are companies that are doing this, but they could be a bit more visible about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add one sentence to this. I also think the business, the corporates we now talk today mainly about refugees, but there's also, of course, other types of migration, regular migration, and their businesses could make it's very strange that they need so much more people at the moment. There is such a need for labor. And I see businesses lobby very little for more regular migration, which would make a lot of sense, that many more people can get work permits to come to the Netherlands and work here officially rather than illegally or through smuggling or some kind of ways. And businesses should feel responsible for that.
Yeah. We have to start rounding off because we're going to be kicked out of this building, first of all. The new COVID rules. Maybe that's a little bridge if someone has a very brief answer to this, because we're all in this COVID situation. And the question was, sorry, I'm going to keep this very short. The question was, Zeynep mentioned that we need an entirely different approach at EU level because we need to harmonize this. But is there actually any political appetite in the light of the situation we're in, high government spending, COVID crisis? I mean, it's not an excuse, but does that allow us to actually make steps forward or not?
I think COVID is the best example.
Yeah,
that you can see that you have to have a rational look to solidarity, because if unless everyone is vaccinated in the world, nobody is safe. That is very obvious now.
Yeah.
And that is the same with many of the situations we talk about. Unless everybody is safe, nobody is really safe.
Yeah.
So the rationality of having more solidarity, I think, is more apparent in COVID than in anywhere else. It just needs to be followed up by action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Vies, you wanted to add something?
Well, I guess there's an irony in that the whole pandemic situation has somehow halted migration for different reasons, and that people don't want to migrate or don't need to move in Europe, but they simply can't because there's no way to move, which has been convenient for some governments. But it might also be an opportunity. There's less of a political spotlight now on, I mean, for us there is because we work on it, but if you look at sort of media attention or where the political discussion is, it's all around the pandemic, and it's not so much the whole time about migration and refugees. So that might be an opportunity to actually talk about rational solutions for certain because there's less of a spotlight on it. So we should maybe use it as an opportunity.
That's interesting compared to what we were just saying about we need to like forcefully speak out and say like this is important, but then actually while the spotlight is somewhere else, you can achieve a lot. Great. I mean, this is the start of a discussion, people. I hope our questions have been satisfied a little bit here in this room. I mean, the whole title of this was seeking. We're obviously seeking, right? We're seeking for ways out, for opportunities. I think it was a beautiful discussion. We spoke about humanity, and Hannah, your point about really staying open to yourself and how you respond to injustice and not shutting yourself up from that. We were talking about everyone has a role to play in that, and also like, if we literally cannot accept what we see around us and not shut off from it, then everything would probably change. If we speak out more forcefully, if we find the unusual suspects to also speak out forcefully with us, like the mayors, if we see that solidarity can actually work, especially seeing that less than 1% of the people in the world are on the move, we can actually pull this off together. If we let's sink in this concept of the politics of letting die, this constant emergency that we're living in, like if we should really start not only indeed I agree, like feeling that with your heart, but with your mind, like what does this mean and what is my role in it? That would make a huge difference. The coalitions of the willing, the resettlements, the relocations, the acknowledgement that this is about global inequality. That's the big elephant in the room that Zeynep pointed out. And so let's keep that on the agenda as well. We need to simultaneously, just work from a different worldview in which equality is the most important, in which solidarity is actionable, and in which humanity is, what we all carry within us and with us. If you would like to stay up to date on these insights, on the research project, on the different speakers, there is this website, the ISS website, that has a whole section titled Research Insights, where you can look up more about what you've heard today, about the different concepts, learn more, see the latest and greatest findings of these ISS researchers and our guests. There was also a question if people could please, the speakers could please share their books, the tips, and like what should we watch, what should we know about. So we're going to ask that and also put that on the Research Insights website. Before we close, I know we had a little poem in mind. Maybe you want to do that in the final closing?
Yes.
Jamel?
Thank you.
Jamel, last time for Jamel. And please, let's hear it for these speakers here. Really, thanks so much.
Yes, I would like to end with a short poem by author, illustrator, and poet Rupi Kaur. Perhaps we're all immigrants, trading one home for another. First, we leave the womb for air, then the suburbs for the filthy city, in search for a better life. Some of us just happen to leave entire countries. And as a final intermezzo, we actually want to show you a video of a group of musicians, and it's a trio that got together in Rotterdam, a very multicultural city here in the Netherlands, with a Syrian clarinetist, Gayet Almagout, Macau Hong Konger pianist, Siu Tin Chi, and Spanish percussionist Eric Larrea. Let's listen to their beautiful sounds.
And enjoy your evening.
Wij zijn daar goed.